Hello everyone, this is Manner of Death. This week's Manner of Death is Homicide. The Cheetham Case. On July 1st, 1991, married couple Iva and Kenneth Cheetham, who were from Washington State, were found shot and killed by Lake Inez, north of Missoula, Montana. A month later, on August 5th, 1991, their van that they had been traveling in was discovered at the end of a logging road west of Lake Alva. Iva and Kenneth's bodies were unfortunately not recovered until the following month on September 11, 1991, by a man walking his dog off Highway 83 in a location roughly 2 miles south of where their van was. Of their items in the van, a Hitachi VM-5200A video camera had been stolen and has never been found since. Although the strap of the camera was found along Highway 80, close by Geraldine, which is a couple hundred miles away from the original spot. What is odd is that Iva's purse had been emptied outside of the van, but none of her checks or credit cards were stolen. The couple was traveling to the area to meet with family in Glacier National Park when they went missing in July of 1991. They were last seen alive at Stoney's Quick Stop at Clearwater Junction. Other clues that could be helpful in solving their case is that the murder weapon is a 9mm pistol based on the shell casings found at the scene. If you have any information that could help solve Iva and Kenneth's case, please contact the Missoula County Sheriff's Office at 406-258-3503 or at 406-258-3302. The Florence triple homicide, or the homicide of Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus. On November 6, 2001, at the Hair Gallery Beauty Salon, Dorothy, in Florence, Montana, Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus were killed. On that fateful day, a customer had entered the beauty salon only to encounter the horrible sight of the 3 women murdered. Their throats had been slashed in broad daylight, which is why they were found so quickly by a client. Lucky for investigators, the boldness of the killer gave them several eyewitnesses to a potential suspect. Several of them described seeing a person wearing a fedora or top hat and a long coat walking near the salon after the murders had occurred. The police did have a suspect by the name of Brian Weber, who had been claiming to investigators that he had been sent to the beauty salon by an Idaho drug dealer to kill the victims because of a supposed drug debt owed by a relative of one of the victims. Weber and another man, Lincoln Benavides, were charged with the murders in 2008. Benavides pleaded to drug charges in a plea agreement that let him off the murder charges. Weber, however, had the charges dropped against him because a key witness had died and the credibility of another was questioned. The charges were formally dropped in 2010. Since then, the case has remained open. If you have any information that could help bring justice to these women, Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus, please call the Missoula County Sheriff's Office at 406-258-3503 or at 406-258-3302. Bertha Scott and Nancy Lagerquist. Bertha E. Scott was an 86-year-old woman residing at the Riverside Healthcare Center when she was killed. She had been born on March 19, 1904, in Pennsylvania and had been previously married to Charles Scott before he passed away in 1963. She had only recently moved to Missoula 2 years prior to her death in order to be near her daughter who lived in the area. She seemed to be an all-around normal elderly woman who had hobbies such as gardening, traveling, and needlepoint. She also seemed to have a lot of family, as her obituary stated she had 20 grandchildren and 31 great-grandchildren. Such a normal woman who was just living out the rest of her life in comfort was tragically killed in her room at the Riverside facility. At first, when she was found, her death had been classified as having been caused by natural issues, since she had been suffering from Alzheimer's and a heart condition. However, her body had been exhumed by the medical examiner and further investigation showed that she had been purposefully killed. A nurse had noticed some discoloration to Bertha's neck, but it was not indicative of anything until much later. It was later released that her cause of death was strangulation. Her death was ruled a homicide. What triggered further investigation into her death was the killing of another Riverside facility resident, 87-year-old Nancy Lagerquist. Nancy's death was more obviously detected as murder from the beginning. On July 1st, 1990, Nancy was taken from her room in the early morning and murdered, after which her body was dumped into the river beside the facility. The police were called to the scene at 4:41 that morning when Nancy was noticed to be gone. At 6:30, her body was found by the fire department, who had put a boat in the Clark Fork River. At the time, it was thought the security at the nursing home was up to par, as it had 24-hour alarms on the door, which would have gone off had someone left or come in. Initially, police did not want to reveal Nancy's cause of death, as they thought it could hinder the investigation. However, it was later announced in the local newspapers that she had died of blunt trauma to the chest and abdomen. She had also been sexually assaulted. There was a man reported to be seen around 4 a.m. east of the Riverside nursing home facility, walking near the parking lot of the Missoula Athletic Club towards Broadway. The man was not seen as a suspect, but potentially an eyewitness. This man was described as white, 30 to 40 years old, and weighed about 180 to 200 pounds. He has light brown, collar-length hair with a mustache and brown-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a white and brown striped t-shirt with tan button-fly shorts and white tennis shoes and socks. Police have been looking for a diaper that Nancy would have been wearing since she would have been abducted in her sleep, and she was recovered without it. It may have held potential evidence. Nancy Lagerquist had lived in Missoula almost all of her life and had been at the center for about a year and a half. She was an unmarried woman who did not have any close relatives. She was incapable of walking on her own and had to be pushed in a wheelchair. She would have needed help to leave the facility. Her room was located on the side of the Riverside facility that faced the river. Staff had checked on Nancy at 3:30 a.m. and she was accounted for, but that changed when they checked again at 4:30, and that was when she was missing. This only gives a 1-hour opportunity for someone to have kidnapped her. Other nursing homes in the area doubled down, but people were frightened because they all had standard security, so how did someone get in the facility without being noticed? As this was all going down, Nancy had requested to not have any services, so she had her last wishes fulfilled during this time. No close relatives attended, as she did not have any, and had few friends left. She had lived and worked in Missoula for all of her adult life. Later on, after Bertha's body had been exhumed and her death determined a homicide, further investigation discovered a window in the Riverside facility's physical therapy room had been tampered with, and also that the window in Nancy's room had been cut as well. It's believed that these were the entry and exit points the killer or killers had taken. Meanwhile, a $5,000 reward had been offered by the Riverside Healthcare Center through Crime Stoppers for the arrest of the murderers. Also, investigators had discovered that Bertha had been sexually assaulted as well, and a semen sample had been collected and taken to have DNA testing conducted. This was in the 1990s, so DNA testing was limited, but they still did it for this case. Unfortunately, numerous suspects' DNA had been tested, and there is no matches to the DNA found with Bertha. Since then, there have been some leads in the form of potential suspects, but all have been dismissed as the killer or killers in this case. For over 30 years, Bertha and Nancy's case remains cold. If you have any information that could help solve their cases, please contact the Missoula County Sheriff's Office at 406-258-3503 or at 406-258-3302. Clifford Nelson. Clifford Nelson, also known as Cliff, was a 48-year-old man living in Seeley Lake, Montana in 1996. He was well known for being a wonderful teacher and even was named State of Montana Teacher of the Year. He taught at the local Seeley Lake Elementary School. He also participated as a ranger for the Little Bighorn National Battlefield Park. Unfortunately, This bright individual's life would be cut short when on September 30th, 1996, an intruder entered his house and shot Clifford. He died from his wounds and the case remains cold. If you have any information that could help solve Clifford's case, please contact the Missoula County Sheriff's Office at 406-258-3503 or at 406-258-3302. Nels and Annie Anderson. Nels and Annie Anderson were a married couple that owned a barber shop on Minnesota Avenue in Billings, Montana. On the night of December 7, 1924, 43-year-old Nels and 39-year-old Annie were packing up to leave when they were accosted by their killer inside the shop. They never made it outside. The next day, their bodies were found inside the barber shop by the local authorities. They had been killed with the axe they used to chop firewood. The scene inside was quite horrific. The police deduced that the killer used a wash basin to clean up the blood, but unfortunately no fingerprints could be found. There was no signs that the shop had been broken into or robbed, which means there was no clean motive for the crime. Police looked into the couple's backgrounds, but there wasn't any reason for someone to hold a grudge against Nels and Annie. Their case still remains unsolved to this day. Richard and Alice Easton. Richard and Alice Easton were an older couple staying at the Paradise Lodge with their family in the month of February in 1963. The couple actually owned the resort, which was located at McGregor Lake, west of Kalispell. Unfortunately, their vacation was gruesomely cut short when the couple was found bludgeoned to death. On February 19, 1963, Alice and Richard were found dead, with Alice inside the lodge discovered by her daughter, and Richard found inside a padlocked garage by police who had been called to the scene. Upon investigation, it was determined that a thin, straight instrument was likely the murder weapon. The crime was likely robbery motivated, as a cash register was stolen and Richard's billfold, both of which were subsequently found later in 1965. Interestingly, a woman came forward 38 years after the Easton murder to claim that her ex-husband was the culprit. Her name is Arlene Lapierre, and she believes that her then-husband, Kenneth Lloyd Pendleton, did it as they had lived in a cabin near the lodge. Arlene Lapierre came forward in 2001 to tell police that Pendleton came to their cabin one night, covered in blood. He stated that he had hit a deer and then said to not ask any questions. He later burned his clothes, according to her testimony. Something helps support her claim is that Pendleton is thought to have been a serial robber, estimated to have robbed up to 80 banks in 8 states. He also escaped prison 3 times and was found beaten and stabbed to death in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada in 2001. This same year, Arlene Lapierre decided to come forward. Even with this testimony, Richard and Alice's case has never been closed and remains unsolved. Jim and Lois Arota. On September 4, 1964, 43-year-old Jim Arota and his wife, 35-year-old Lois Arota, were found stabbed by a beer salesman in the Super Safe Market in the east side of Great Falls, which is where Jim worked as a manager. It was a gruesome scene, with Lois's body being tied to the back door of the market. Clothesline and a gag were used to restrain her. Jim was also found tied up and gagged, and it's thought the cloth used to gag them came from the aprons used by the store's employees. Their murder weapon was a long knife, and it was collected at the scene. Broken bottles of Pepsi were also found at the scene, and it's thought they were used to hit the Arotas. The motive for the killing is burglary, and the theory is that the Arotas were kidnapped from their home, where they lived with 7 children during the night, and taken to open up the store's safe. However, Jim could not open the safe in any case, since it is locked on a timer. The Arotas' car was located near their house, meaning whoever abducted them drove the car back from the market to that area before leaving it. Upon investigation, it was known that a coin collection belonging to Jim had been taken from the home. The empty coin book was found later on close to the Black Eagle Dam. An initial suspect was Alan Reevely, who was an ex-employee from the supermarket, who had been fired several weeks prior to the murder. In 2002, Reevely was charged with the Arrota's murders. Several witnesses testified that Reevely had stated during a religious event that he had killed some people when he was a young man, and that he also had been the one to find the bodies. However, no physical evidence could link Reevely to the case, and he was found not guilty in 2004. Since then, the Arrota's case remains unsolved. Marjorie and Nancy McQuiston. On April 9, 1965, it was noticed that 51-year-old Marjorie McQuiston and her daughter 27-year-old Nancy were missing. 5 days after they went missing, on April 14, 1965, their bodies were found on the top of a hill northwest of Butte, Montana, about a mile from their home on 945 17th Street. They were found beaten and died of gunshot wounds. In the house, there were bullet holes and objects with blood on them. The actual murder weapon is thought to be Nancy McQuiston's weapon, a .22 caliber automatic pistol, which was found in the house as well. Nancy's car was found a quarter-mile away from their remains in a gully. Apparently, the trunk contained blood and most likely demonstrates that the McQuistons were moved after they were murdered. Eerily enough, the police had another murder case on their hands, with the killing of Joanne Kankelborg, a 17-year-old who went missing the same day as the McQuistons. Her body was found on the 15th of April, and her case was solved when Jerry Van Newland was charged with her death. However, police were never able to connect the two cases together, and while Van Newland pleaded guilty and was sentenced for Joanne's case, Nancy and Marjorie McQuiston's case remains unsolved to this day.